Doctors of Reddit. What was your how the f***ck did you survive that moment? Please subscribe, leave a like, comment and share the video to help the channel. Not a doctor, but I'm a firefighter, so I see my fair share of trauma. About a year ago, we responded to a call that went out as an individual who had a car fall on his face. He was hotboxing in his garage while working underneath his car that was supported by scissor jacks. Something to note, the car didn't have any tires on the front end where he was working. One of the scissor jacks had slipped out from underneath the car, and the whole weight of the car landed directly onto the side of his head with no tires to stop the fall. We got our rubber airbags out, lifted the car, pulled him out, and got him onto a stretcher. After taking 2,500 pounds of weight to the head, he somehow got out of it with a fractured orbital and a laceration on his cheek. First year of my core surgical training, I was on call in a very small rural hospital. This hospital only had 2 doctors on at night, me and a medical trainee, and no emergency doctors. It's about 11 PM and this guy, 26, comes in after being in a fight. Blood pumping from his nose, which was clearly fractured. I suspected he probably had other facial fractures underneath, but he was awake and talking to me, otherwise seemed fine. I spent about 45 minutes trying to stop the blood, using all sorts of nose packs, pressure, even tried a catheter balloon to try and tamponade it. Nothing was working, and he was starting to go into shock, and I was basically shitting myself at this stage. Based on his vitals, I'd estimated he'd lost almost 1.5 liters of blood so far. Nearest proper surgical hospital was 45 minutes away, and my consultant was at home, 25 minutes from the hospital. Eventually I got 4 bags of egg from the lab tech happened to be in, which was very lucky. Put this guy in the back of an ambulance, still bleeding, and sent him blow light to the surgical center in the city. Got a phone call about 3 hours later from a surgeon at the other hospital, saying he had brought the patient to theater and been able to control the situation. He was probably 15 minutes from dead. If you come into that kind of small hospital with that much bleeding, all stats say you're in trouble. The guy was very lucky his friends got him in so quickly. I was a surgical resident in a small town hospital. We got paged to see a patient for a spared piece of driftwood through the leg. We were thinking it was an femoral artery and discussing if this poor kid needed amputation. When we saw him, he was standing on the skewered leg taking a piss. Turns out the wood missed every single one of the vital vessels and no fracture, just muscular damage. Junior doc on the trauma team. Doors to resus fly open to reveal a man carrying a second blood-soaked man in his arms. Get him onto a stretcher, and it is clear he has gunshot wound to his chest and has gone into cardiac arrest. A systole. Chest compressions start, and within minutes the R&D consultant is performing an open thoracotomy in order to start cardiac massage. Cardiothoracics join us quickly and get to work on the heart. A hole in the right ventricle is identified and plugged with a Farley catheter. All the while bag after bag of egg is being pushed into the patient in an attempt to replace everything that had pumped out of his heart and into his thoracic cavity. 15 to 20 minutes into this, the impossible happens. We get ROSC. The heart starts beating in its own. Patient is taken directly to theater, where the hole is definitively repaired, and bilateral chest drains are inserted to drain the blood filling his lungs, technically the pleural space. Somehow his heart continued beating, and after a couple weeks on a 2, the patient is returned to the trauma ward awake and alert. Several weeks, some mild hypoxic brain injury, and an early chest scar later, and he walks off the ward with his dad, the man who carried him in. Eat a definition of ROSC. Every time I think this question, the answer is usually meth. One guy got hit in the face hard enough to let air into his brain cavity and was being an absolute asshole, which seemed to be normal for him, and literally asked, "Got any meth?" When I offered some pain relief. To my understanding, he recovered without any need for surgery. Emergency nurse. Once had a guy come in who had been cutting a tree with a chainsaw when it hit a knot in the wood and kicked up into his neck. Finished cutting the tree because he knew his wife would make him get rid of the chainsaw. Put a towel on it and drove himself to the hospital. Court showed no vascular damage, simple washout and home the next day. One of the paramedics who saw him said to his patient, "That's a real emergency. Why don't we ever get those?" Edit. Location Australia, Queensland. I had a patient that attempted suicide with an R15 under the chin. Put a hole in the soft tissues of the floor of his mouth, in his tongue, in his hard palate, and then split the hemispheres of his brain perfectly, finally popping out the top of his skull. He recovered fully. I was working in the emergency department when a toddler came in after falling out of a 3-story window completely unharmed. The sad thing was they were from a rough neighborhood and the mum hadn't noticed for about half an hour. Apparently the friendly apartment pot smokers found him, checked him over, and sat with him for half an hour, and when mum didn't show up went to find her. The child was admitted overnight mostly for social reasons, but it's just amazing how well kids bounce. Not a doctor yet, but I worked in a trauma center as a scribe before starting med school. Basically, I was attached at the hip with a doctor to do their documentation. One guy wrecked his car into a wooden fence, and a wooden fence post went in his mouth and came out the back of his neck. It was the kind of fence post that was double the size of his mouth. It had basically pushed all of the important anatomy to the side as it impaled him. There were consulting doctors for like 10 different specialties working on this guy in the hospital. Several weeks later, after he fully recovered, he walked back in the emergency department to thank everyone. Well, if he did it telepathically, I'm going to start deep throating fence posts. Not a doctor but paramedic. Once went a car wreck where a drunk drove headfirst into the corner of a brick bridge at 100 miles per hour. Took a huge wedge out of the bottom of the bridge and left the car about 1/4 of its normal length. All the impact was on the driver's side. Turned up only 2 minutes after the crash and fully expected it to be a fatality. Walked round to the driver's side and somehow he was fully conscious, but squeezed into the only space left in the car. Took almost 3 hours to get him out, and on extracting him out he had absolutely nothing wrong with him other than being a pissed up asshole. Still think how the fuck did he survive that? Not a doctor, but a friend's story. He'd been feeling like shit for a long time, went to the doctor. Doctor ordered a bunch of blood tests, and ordered them on a rush basis. The lab calls the doctor to bitch him out. Why the fuck did you make us rush these tests? Doctor is confused. Lab is like, the guy is clearly dead, so what's the fucking rush? Doctor calls him, tells him to not drive, but to get himself to emergency as soon as possible. Guy was a type 1 diabetic, hadn't realized it until way later in life, and apparently his blood work suggested he was a corpse, rather than a living person. He's still doing fine. Not a doctor yet, but during one of my night shift as a medical student, I had to take in charge a patient who came to the ER for a car accident. Well, that's quite common. What is not is that he came by himself from 40 kms by calling a taxi because his car was absolutely wrecked in the accident. Normally, when your car ends up upside down, after 2 or 3 rollovers at 60 km/h, which the patient did, you are not really fine. However, he was totally okay. No broken bone, no head trauma, no abdominal pain, nothing. He just came to the ER because he had little dermabrasions over his knees and one elbow, and it hurts when it rubs against my clothes. 3 band-aids later, and he was good to go. Not a doctor, but a fellow worker took a 35-pound steel plate being propelled by 3770C, equivalent to 188.5 car tires, to the face. Sent him 15 feet in the air and 40 feet back. Broke every bone in his face. Lived and back to work 8 months later. Edit, my math with car tires is awful. I'd meant to try and put it in terms I thought Redditors may understand. Also, till car tires optimal C rating is 32-35. It was 26 MPa 5500 meter hole with 2 7/8 tubing on a 6.5 inches cased hole with roughly 350 of 3-inch flow line to a 3 inches 10,000 C rated manifold. It's a lot of pressure. Patient, not as cool as most of these, but I was puking for 3 days straight before going into urgent care. I wasn't even going to go in, but my family said I looked awful, and I eventually relented. They said I had appendicitis. Due to a mix-up I didn't get operated on for over a day later. When they went in, my appendix was gangrenous and had basically disintegrated. Turns out it had burst/ruptured days ago. Normally, this floods your body with toxins and you die, but apparently my colon was positioned in such a way that it blocked that from happening. I was in the hospital for another week before my digestive system restarted and had to have bile pumped out of my stomach. All in all though, not a terrible experience. Intern year doing surgery, guy gets brought in for a gunshot wound to the head. He was working at a jeweler that got robbed. His coworker was black bagged at the scene. He gets brought into the trauma bay and it's pretty hectic because GSW to the head and well he's alive. Not only is he alive, he's following commands but not speaking, probably from the shock. Cops are giving us reports saying he was likely shot with a .357 snub nose they recovered at the scene. So we do our primary and secondary survey and all this guy has is a single wood wound to his left frontal scalp where the bullet went in. So the team hasn't really seen something like this before. Sure, a GSW to the head wasn't new, but this guy was otherwise completely fine. The decision was made to get a quick frontal and late head x-ray to verify where the bullet was before proceeding to court. Well, we don't see any bullet on the films. There's no bullet on the board or bed or within the patient's clothes. The man was shot in the head and the bullet bounced off his skull. Court showed no fracture even. It was wild. Never seen anything like that since. So a common question I'm getting is how do we know it was a GSW? He had gunpowder burns on his forehead around the wound. Please subscribe, leave a like, comment and share the video to help the channel.